The wedding dress had been folded in lavender and cedar for 3 years, and every single morning Dorothy Donnelly walked past the cedar chest at the foot of her bed without opening it, because she had learned that some kinds of hope, left untended, could hollow a person out from the inside just as surely as drought hollowed out the Colorado River come August. The year was 1878, and the town of Harlow Creek, Texas, sat baking under a sun that showed no mercy to anyone who dared question its authority. It was a small town, the kind that had exactly one church, one saloon, one general store, and enough gossip to fill a newspaper if anyone had bothered to print one. Dorothy had lived there her whole 26 years, first as the daughter of Franklin Donnelly, who had run the general store with a firm hand and a generous spirit, and then as his inheritor after a fever took him in the winter of 1876. She had kept the store running because there was nothing else to do, and because work had a way of filling the hours that grief and disappointment left so terribly empty. She was not a woman people overlooked. She was tall for her time, with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned back during working hours, and let loose only in the evenings when there was no one around to see it fall past her shoulders in long, heavy waves. She had green eyes the color of river glass, and a mouth that was accustomed to being pressed into a straight, composed line that told the world she was perfectly fine. Thank you very much. The people of Harlow Creek respected her and quietly pitied her in equal measure, though they were wise enough never to let the pity show directly to her face. 3 years ago, Dorothy had been engaged to a man named Carlton Briggs. Carlton had come through Harlow Creek as a traveling land surveyor, a man with fine manners, a silver pocket watch, and a way of talking about the future that made it seem inevitable and golden. He had courted Dorothy with letters after he left, 1 letter per week for 4 months, each one more specific than the last about the life they would build together in Fort Worth, where he claimed to have secured a position with a land office. He had sent her a date for the wedding and told her to prepare, and Dorothy, who had spent her whole careful life waiting for something worth believing in, had believed in Carlton Briggs with her whole heart. She had sewn the wedding dress herself. It had taken 6 weeks of working by lamplight after the store closed, her fingers sore and her eyes strained, the white cotton lawn fabric spread across her father's kitchen table like something sacred. She had trimmed it with Brussels lace she had ordered all the way from a dry goods catalog, spending more than she should have, and she had embroidered tiny bluebonnets along the hem because they were Texas flowers, and she wanted something of home even in her new life. The dress was the most beautiful thing she had ever made. She had finished it 10 days before the wedding date, hung it on the back of her bedroom door, and waited. Carlton Briggs never came. There was no letter of explanation, no message of any kind. There was simply an absence where a man had been, a silence where promises had lived, and Dorothy standing at the church on a Saturday morning in her everyday clothes, because she had refused to put on the dress until she heard the wagon wheels on the road, and the wagon wheels never came. She found out later, through the particular cruelty of small-town gossip, that Carlton Briggs had married a woman in Austin 2 months prior to their scheduled wedding. He had apparently forgotten to mention this to Dorothy, or had simply decided that distance made the problem manageable. Dorothy had received this information while stocking a shelf of flour sacks, and she had continued stocking the shelf without stopping, and she had not cried until she was home, and the door was locked, and the dress was folded into the cedar chest where she never had to look at it. That had been 3 years ago, and life had gone on the way life insists on doing regardless of whether you are ready for it. The morning Daniel Hartwell rode into Harlow Creek was a Thursday in late April, and the wind was doing something unusual and generous, blowing in from the south with the faint green smell of approaching rain. Dorothy was sweeping the front porch of the general store when she heard the horse, and she looked up the way anyone looks up at the sound of something new in a town where sounds rarely changed. He was riding a sorrel mare with a white star on her forehead, and he sat the horse the way men who have spent their whole lives in the saddle do, easy and unself-conscious, like sitting a horse was simply the natural condition of his body. He was somewhere around 30, Dorothy guessed, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar from the trail dust and sweat, and a face that was weathered but not hard, tanned deep from sun and wind, but with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into bright distances rather than from meanness. He wore a faded blue shirt and worn leather chaps over dark trousers, and there was a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a Colt on his hip that he wore with the ease of a man who carries a tool he knows how to use rather than a weapon he is trying to impress anyone with. He stopped at the hitching post in front of the store and swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, looping the reins over the post and giving the mare a brief pat on the neck that Dorothy noticed, because a man who is patient with his horse usually has something worth knowing in him. He came up the steps and touched the brim of his hat to her, which was a gesture she appreciated for its simplicity and its lack of excessive performance. "Morning," he said. "This the general store?" "It is," Dorothy said, "though I imagine the sign was something of a clue." He looked at the sign above the door and there was a brief, genuine smile, the kind that doesn't telegraph itself in advance but simply arrives. "Fair point," he said. "I apologize. I have been on the trail 4 days and my observational skills are somewhat diminished. I am looking for a few supplies and I was told there might be a room available somewhere in town." "Mrs. Calloway takes in boarders," Dorothy said. "2 streets over, the white house with the blue shutters. She sets a decent table." "I am obliged to you," he said. He came through the door she held open, and she followed him inside, going behind the counter while he moved through the store with the quiet efficiency of a man who knows what he needs and is not given to browsing. He set his supplies on the counter methodically. Coffee, dried beans, a new box of ammunition, a tin of salve, a length of rope, and a small paper sack of horehound candies that he placed down almost apologetically. "My one weakness," he said when he caught her looking at them. "I have been known to indulge in them myself," she said. She began tallying his bill. "You passing through?" "Possibly," he said. "I have been told there is work to be had around here. I am a cattle man by trade. I heard the Alcott Ranch is looking for hands after losing several to a better offer up in Wyoming." "The Alcott Ranch is always looking for someone," Dorothy said. "Ed Alcott works his men hard and does not always pay on time. I say that not to discourage you, but so you know what you are walking into." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "Most people would not bother." "Most people would not," she agreed. She told him his total, and he paid it without complaint, pocketing his change and beginning to load his supplies into the canvas saddlebag he had brought in. "Daniel Hartwell," he said, extending his hand across the counter. She shook it. His hand was rough and warm and the grip was honest without being theatrical. "Dorothy Donnelly," she said. "My family has run this store for 30 years. "Miss Donnelly," he said. "Miss," she confirmed, and she said it the way she always said it, without apology or explanation, as a simple fact of her situation. He nodded and picked up his saddlebag. "I expect I will be back for more supplies," he said. "Thank you for the information about Mrs. Calloway and about Ed Alcott." "The Calloway information is reliable," she said. "The Alcott information may or may not persuade you as you see fit." That brief smile again. "Good day, Miss Donnelly." He walked out, and she watched through the window as he untied the sorrel and rode on down the street, and she went back to sweeping the porch and told herself she was not thinking about him. She was thinking about him. She thought about him intermittently for the following 3 days, which was inconvenient and unhelpful, and she dealt with it the way she dealt with most inconvenient things, which was to keep busy and wait for the feeling to subside. She took inventory of the store. She wrote letters to her supplier in San Antonio. She helped old Mr. Perkins figure out why his harness had broken again, and she baked 2 loaves of bread she did not need. He came back on Sunday afternoon. The store was technically closed on Sunday, But Dorothy kept the door unlocked during afternoon hours because people in the territory needed things on Sundays the same as any other day, and she did not see the point in being rigid about it. She was in the back room going through a new shipment of fabric when she heard the bell above the front door. "We are open," she called out, "but please excuse the disorder." She came out front wiping her hands on her apron and found him standing in the middle of the store looking at the shelves with the concentrated attention of a man who is actually looking at things rather than just waiting. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. She was slightly startled and hoped it did not show. "Miss Donnelly," he said, "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all. Did you take the position at Alcott's?" "I did," he said. "You were correct on both counts. The work is hard and the timeline of payment is something we are still negotiating. However, the job exists and I needed one, so there it is." He paused. "I was wondering if I might purchase some thread and a needle. I am in need of some repairs to my shirt, and I cannot find Mrs. Calloway's sewing basket anywhere within reasonable reach." "Of course," she said. She went to the notions section and pulled out a paper of needles and a spool of dark blue thread. "This should match reasonably well," she said, looking at his shirt. "If you want it to match perfectly, you would need this one." She held up a second spool, slightly darker. He looked at the two spools with an expression of genuine deliberation that amused her. "The second one," he decided. "If I am doing the repair, I might as well do it properly." "A sound philosophy," she said. She rang up the purchase and he paid it. Then he did not immediately leave. He stood at the counter, and there was a brief pause that had nothing awkward in it, which Dorothy found interesting because silences with strangers were almost always awkward. "I heard in town that you run this store alone," he said. "Your father passed." "Word travels fast in Harlow Creek," she said. "Small towns are all the same in that regard," he said. "I grew up in one, Colby, Kansas, smaller than this one even." "What brought you to Texas?" "Cattle work brought me south and kept bringing me south," he said. "I have been following work for about 9 years now. Kansas, Oklahoma Territory, New Mexico, now here." He was quiet for a moment. "It is a good life, but it does not put down many roots." "No," she said. "I imagine it does not." There was something in his voice when he said it that she noticed, something that was not quite regret but was adjacent to it, the way you can sense a body of water nearby without being able to see it. "Do you have family?" she asked. She was not sure why she asked. "Not close family," he said. "My parents are gone. I had a brother in Kansas, but he has his own life and we do not write as often as we should." He looked down at the thread and needle in his hand. "You?" "I have my father's older sister in Galveston," Dorothy said. "She writes at Christmas. That is the extent of it." He nodded. "Well," he said. He seemed to decide something. "I will not keep you from your Sunday." "But I thank you, Miss Donnelly." "Dorothy," she said, and was immediately not sure why she said that either. He looked at her. "Dorothy," he said. The way he said her name was careful and deliberate, the way you say something you want to get right. "Daniel." "Daniel," she said. He left, and this time when she watched him go through the window she did not tell herself she was not thinking about him because the effort was clearly wasted. The spring in Harlow Creek moved along in the way Texas springs do, in long days of golden warmth broken by sudden fierce afternoon storms that swept in off the plains and shook everything loose for an hour, and then moved on and left the air smelling clean and the ground dark with rain. Dorothy settled into a new rhythm she had not planned, which was that Daniel Hartwell came into the store 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes for actual supplies and sometimes without any obvious purpose beyond stopping, and they talked. They talked about everything and nothing, the way two people talk when they are not yet certain what they are doing but are not willing to stop doing it. He told her about the cattle drives he had ridden, about a winter in New Mexico when the snow had come down so hard that the ranch hands had been stranded for 3 weeks and had run out of everything except coffee and bad humor. She told him about growing up in the store, learning to read from the labels on cans and bolts of fabric, helping her father negotiate with suppliers who thought a man's daughter was something to be managed rather than listened to. "You straightened them out, I expect." Daniel said, leaning against the counter one afternoon in May while she reorganized a shelf of canned goods. My father taught me that the best negotiating position is thorough knowledge of what the other person needs, she said. If they need to sell more than you need to buy, the advantage is yours. If the reverse is true, you acknowledge it gracefully and find a middle ground. She set a can of tomatoes in its place with a small, precise click. He was a practical man. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Daniel said. She felt the small, familiar ache of missing her father. He was, she said. He was straightforward and honest, and he believed that people were generally trying their best, even when the evidence was against them. That is a generous belief to hold in this part of the world, Daniel said. He was a generous man, she said simply. There were evenings when she was closing up the store and Daniel happened to be passing by after his day at the Alcott Ranch, still covered in the honest dirt of cattle work, and he would offer to walk her to her house, which was only a block and a half away, and she would accept because she wanted to and because she was, slowly and cautiously, learning to allow herself to want things again. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Harlow Creek's appetite for other people's business was reliable as sunrise. Mrs. Hatch, who ran the millinery shop, mentioned to Dorothy that it was nice to see her with some company. Dorothy thanked her with a smile that gave away nothing. The Reverend Mallory's wife asked with elaborate casualness whether the Hartwell man from the Alcott Ranch was a church-going person, and Dorothy said she did not know his habits in that regard. Tom Prentice at the saloon told Daniel, apparently, that Miss Donnelly was a fine woman with a sad history, and Daniel had thanked him for his concern and drank his beer and said nothing further, which Tom Prentice reported back to his wife, who reported it to 3 other women by morning. Dorothy knew what they were all circling. They were circling the story of Carlton Briggs and the dress in the cedar chest, and the day the wagon never came. It was a story that had been told so many times in Harlow Creek that it had acquired the smooth, worn quality of a river stone, all the jagged edges rubbed away. She did not resent them for knowing it. She resented, slightly, that it had become a kind of defining mark on her, the woman who had been left, the woman who kept her wedding dress in a cedar chest, the cautionary tale in white cotton lawn and Brussels lace. On an evening in early June, when the sun was going down enormous and orange over the flat western horizon, and the air had cooled to something bearable, Dorothy and Daniel sat on the front steps of the store which she had already locked, sharing a paper bag of horehound candies he had brought and talking about nothing in particular. The street was quiet. The last few people were heading home, and the town was settling into its evening sounds, a dog somewhere, the distant noise from the saloon, the creak of a wagon. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. "You can ask," she said. She had learned that with him the answer was almost always yes, but she liked to give herself the formal option. He was quiet for a moment, turning a horehound candy in his fingers. "There is something people mention," he said slowly, "not directly to me, but in the way that people in small towns mention things sideways and in pieces, about something that happened to you a few years back." He looked at her directly. "You do not have to tell me anything. I am not asking for the story. I am asking if you are all right." She was quiet for a long moment. The orange light moved across the dust of the street. "That is an interesting question," she said finally. "The answer depends on what all right means." "I meant it the way it sounded," he said. "Not are you surviving, because clearly you are. But are you all right in yourself?" She looked at him. She had not expected the precision of that question. She had expected the usual clumsy dance of concern that people offered, the oblique references and sympathetic head tilts. He was asking something real. "Most days, yes," she said honestly. "Some days, no. I have learned not to give the bad days more weight than they deserve." He nodded. "That takes practice," he said. "It does," she agreed. "A great deal of it." They sat for another few minutes in the comfortable quiet that had become natural between them. "A man," she said then, because she found she wanted to tell him, not because the town had made the story familiar, but because she wanted him to know it from her. I was engaged 3 years ago. He was a land surveyor, a traveling man. We corresponded for months. I made preparations." She paused. "He did not arrive. I found out afterward that he had married someone else in the interim and apparently forgotten to inform me of this development." Daniel did not say anything for a moment. His jaw was set in a way that was not anger exactly, but was something firm and serious. "Dorothy," he said. "It was 3 years ago," she said. "It is past." "That does not make it nothing," he said. "No," she admitted. "It does not make it nothing." She looked out at the street. "The part that occupied me longest was not the grief of losing him, because in retrospect I think I loved the idea of him more than the actual man. The part that occupied me longest was the understanding that I had made myself very foolish, and that everyone knew it, and that I would carry that for a long time." "You were not foolish," Daniel said. "You believed someone who gave you reason to believe him. The foolishness, if there is any to be assigned, belongs entirely to him." She looked at him. There was something very steady in his face, something that did not waver. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that plainly." "I say most things plainly," he said. "It saves time." She smiled. He looked at her smile like it was something he wanted to remember. The summer arrived with serious intent. The heat in Harlow Creek in July was not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It was a physical presence that pressed down on the flat land from above and radiated up from the baked earth below, and the only sensible response was to do what needed doing before noon and move slowly afterward. Dorothy kept the store as cool as possible with the canvas awnings her father had rigged over the windows years ago, and kept a pitcher of water with sliced lemon on the counter that she refilled twice a day. Daniel was working long days at the Alcott Ranch and looked it, lean and sun-worn. But he still came to the store regularly and still walked with her in the evenings. And she noticed that the walks were getting slightly longer, taking a route that went past the old cottonwood grove at the edge of town, where the shade made the air briefly cooler. He had been in Harlow Creek almost 3 months when Ed Alcott, true to Dorothy's prediction, delayed payment to his hands for the second time running. Daniel came into the store on a Thursday evening with a calm set to his face that she had learned meant he was managing his frustration rather than not feeling it. "Alcott again," she said. "Third time paying late," he said. He leaned on the counter. "He claims the sale of the last drive's cattle has been held up in a banking complication in San Antonio. It may be true, it may not be true. Either way, I am owed 2 months' wages. Are the other hands staying on? Most of them. They are in the same position and have nowhere immediately to go." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I have some savings. I'm not in crisis, but I dislike the situation." "Have you thought about leaving?" she asked. She kept her voice level and neutral, but something in her was very quiet and still, waiting for his answer. He looked at her for a moment. "I have thought about it," he said honestly. "The ranch work is good work regardless of Alcott's habits, and I find I have reasons to stay in Harlow Creek that have nothing to do with cattle." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at the counter, which she began wiping with a cloth that did not need wiping. "That is a reasonable consideration," she said. "Dorothy," he said. She said, not looking up. "I am trying to say something," he said with a patience and a hint of humor that she found impossible to resist. She looked up. He was watching her with that direct, steady look that she had come to understand meant he was saying exactly what he meant. "I am aware," she said. "I am trying to decide how to receive it." "Take your time," he said. "I am in no particular hurry." She set the cloth down. "You know my history," she said. "You know I am careful." "You are not careful," he said gently. "You are cautious, which is entirely different and entirely sensible given what you have been through. Careful suggests excessive worry. Cautious suggests wisdom." She stared at him. "Where did you learn to make those kinds of distinctions?" "My mother was a schoolteacher," he said. She believed that the exact right word was not an indulgence but a responsibility. "I like your mother," Dorothy said. "She would have liked you," he said, and the simplicity of it hit her somewhere unexpectedly deep because there was no performance in it. It was just a true thing he was saying. "Daniel," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would like to take things slowly," she said. Not because I do not appreciate what you are saying, because I need to be sure that I am responding to you and not to the idea of you." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "That is exactly the right thing to say, and I respect it completely." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." "We do," he said. He bought a can of peaches and a new pair of leather gloves and said good night, and she watched him go and pressed her hand flat against the counter for a moment and breathed slowly. July passed in the particular long, slow burn of a Texas summer, and in August, the rains that the territory needed came 2 weeks late but came thoroughly, drenching the brown grass back to something reluctantly green and filling the creek that had given the town its name back to a proper level. Dorothy and Daniel moved through the season the way she had asked, slowly, with intention, learning each other in the way that is deeper and more lasting than the quick, bright flare of romance. She learned that he made coffee too strong and was unapologetic about it. She learned that he had a habit of whittling in the evenings, turning pieces of mesquite wood into small, precise objects, a horse, a bird, a miniature boot, that he gave away to people without ceremony. She learned that he read, which was not universal among the men she had known, and that he preferred history and accounts of exploration to fiction, though he made an exception for Mark Twain. He borrowed her copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and returned it with a brief, amused report. She learned that he had a past that was not simple. In late August, sitting under the cottonwoods in the early evening, he told her about a previous attachment of his own, a woman in Oklahoma Territory named Helen, with whom he had spent 2 years before she had chosen to marry a man with a land deed and a house already built. And who could blame her, he said, because he had been 24 and had nothing but a saddle and a good horse and intentions that were genuine but economically insubstantial. "Did it break you?" Dorothy asked. She was watching a mockingbird in the branches above. "For a time," he said, "about a year. Then I worked myself out of it." He was quiet. "I think what it broke more than my heart specifically was my willingness to try again. I became very focused on the work and not on the rest of it." "Until," she said. "Until," he agreed. She reached over and put her hand on his, which was resting on the log they were sitting on, and he turned it over and held her hand in his, and they sat like that for a long while with the evening coming on around them, and the mockingbird running through its repertoire of other bird songs in the branches above. And Dorothy thought that this particular moment was something she would remember precisely. The roughness of his hand, the smell of cottonwood and coming cool air. The feeling of something very slowly and carefully opening in her that had been closed for 3 years. He rode out with the Alcott cattle drive in early September. It was a drive up to Abilene, a 3-week job that he had committed to before the question of his staying in Harlow Creek had truly crystallized, and he told her about it a week in advance so she had time to adjust to the information, which she appreciated even as she was aware of the old, involuntary tightening in her chest at the idea of a man saying he would go and then going. "I am coming back," he said. He said it looking directly at her with the same steady, direct look he always used when he was saying something he meant absolutely. "Dorothy, I am coming back." "I know," she said. She did know. She had spent 3 years learning the difference between knowledge and trust and the gap between them, and she was trying hard to close that gap. "I know you are. If I come back and find you have rearranged the whole store, I will not complain," he said. "But I wanted you to know that I will be back in 3 weeks and that I intend to continue exactly where we left off." "And where did we leave off?" she asked, meeting his eyes. He looked at her for a moment. "Somewhere worth returning to," he said. She walked him to the hitching post outside the store, where his sorrel mare was waiting with the characteristic patience of a well-trained horse, and he turned before mounting and took her hand and pressed it briefly, and she let him, and then he was up and riding, and she watched him go down the main street of Harlow Creek until the dust settled. 3 weeks was a long time. She knew how to fill it. She had been filling long stretches of time alone for years, but this 3 weeks had a different quality to it, a forward-facing expectation rather than the flat, undifferentiated time that had followed Carlton's disappearance. She wrote orders to her suppliers. She helped the widow Parker put up her winter preserves. She attended the church social and endured the well-meaning inquiries about the Hartwell man with good humor. She took out her father's old account books and reorganized them, a task she had been putting off for 2 years. On a Tuesday evening in the second week, she found herself in her bedroom for no clear reason, standing in front of the cedar chest. She had not opened it since she had put the dress in. She stood there for what felt like a long time, her hand not quite touching the latch, thinking about the person she had been when she sewed that dress and the person she was now, and about the distance between those two people, and about whether that distance was loss or growth or some irreducible combination of both. She opened the chest. The smell of lavender and cedar came up strongly, the herbs she had tucked in to keep the fabric from yellowing. The dress was folded in tissue paper, and the tissue paper had held. She lifted it out carefully and sat on the edge of the bed with it in her lap, the white cotton lawn still white, the Brussels lace still whole, the embroidered bluebonnets along the hem exactly as she had left them. She had put so much of herself into this dress. She had put hope into it, and love, and the particular hard-won faith of someone who had spent a life being careful and had decided, one carefully chosen time, to be reckless with her belief. And the faith had not been rewarded, and the dress had gone into the chest, and she had become the woman who kept her wedding dress in a cedar chest, and that was that. She sat with it for a while. She did not cry, which surprised her slightly. She felt something more complex than grief, something that was partly sadness for the person she had been, and partly a strange kind of tenderness toward that person, as though she were looking at someone young and hopeful from a greater height and thinking, with compassion rather than contempt, that the hope had not been wrong even if the object of it had been unworthy. She folded the dress carefully back into the tissue paper and placed it in the chest and closed the latch. But she left the chest where it was, at the foot of the bed, and this time she did not walk past it without seeing it. She looked at it, and let it be a thing that existed in her room rather than a thing she was trying not to think about, and this felt, in a quiet way, like progress. Daniel Hartwell came back on the 22nd day. She heard his horse in the street before she saw him, and she came to the door of the store with a deliberately composed expression that she hoped looked like ordinary calm. He was trail-worn and dusty from the road, and the sorrel was tired, and he was leading a second horse, a young buckskin gelding with a braided rope halter that he tied next to the sorrel at the hitching post. He came up the steps and took off his hat. 22 days, she said. I rode hard the last 2, he said, and the way he said it without elaboration or explanation, just as a fact, told her everything she needed to know about why he had ridden hard. Come inside, she said. I will make coffee. That sounds like exactly what I need, he said. She made coffee in the small back room of the store where she kept a stove for cold days, and he sat on an upended crate and watched her, and they talked, slowly at first, because he was tired, and then more steadily as the coffee warmed him up and the road came off him in increments. He had been paid in Abilene, he told her. Alcott had made good on the full owed amount plus the Abilene wages. It was a substantial sum by the standards of the territory, not a fortune, but a real amount that a careful person could do something with. I have been thinking, he said, about what comes next. She poured a second cup of coffee and sat across from him. What have you decided? I have decided, he said, with the measured, considered delivery of a man who has thought about this carefully over a great many miles, that I do not want to keep following work from place to place indefinitely. I have done it for 9 years and I have learned what I set out to learn, but I think it is time for something different. He looked at her. There is a piece of land north of town, the old Brennan parcel. I heard the bank has it now since Brennan moved to New Mexico. I went by the bank this morning before I came here. She was very still. You came by the bank this morning before you came here. I wanted to have something real to say, he said simply, not just intentions. The land is 800 acres of decent grazing with a creek running through it. The bank is asking a fair price and I can meet most of it. I would need to put in the first season's work before I could think about building much on it. Daniel, she said, I am not asking you anything right now, he said carefully. I want to be clear about that. I am telling you where my thinking is. What the shape of my life is starting to look like to me so that you can know it. Because you deserve to know what a man is actually planning before you have to decide anything about it. She looked at him for a long moment. The back room was warm and quiet, and the smell of coffee was strong and good, and outside the street of Harlow Creek was going on with its everyday life. That is very different from how these things usually go, she said. Yes, he said. Most men state their intentions and assume the rest follows automatically, she said. I am aware, he said. I do not find that approach sensible or respectful. She stood up and took her coffee cup to the small window that looked out into the alley and stood there for a moment looking out. She could see the corner of her own house from this window, the back fence of the vegetable garden she kept. I have been here my whole life, she said. This store, this street, this town. I have always wondered what it said about me that I stayed, whether it was loyalty or love of home or just fear of change. She turned. My father left the whole place to me, and I have run it with everything I had. But I am 26 years old, and I have spent most of those years in this building. Dorothy, he said, and the way he said her name was very gentle. I'm not saying I want to go anywhere, she said. I am saying I am still finding out who I am, and I think you should know that about me before I decide anything. That seems entirely fair, he said. She came back and sat down across from him. When do you speak to the bank? Tomorrow, he said. Bring me the terms, she said. I know numbers. I can tell you if they are trying to overcharge you. He looked at her with something open and warm in his expression. All right, he said. She brought him the terms the next morning, spread on the counter of the store, and they went through them together side by side, Dorothy's finger moving along the columns of figures while Daniel leaned over her shoulder reading, and she was aware of his nearness in a way that was entirely distracting and had to concentrate harder than usual. The terms were reasonable. She told him so, and told him where he had room to negotiate one point regarding the annual interest on the remainder, and he took her notes to the bank and came back 2 hours later having negotiated exactly the point she had identified. He purchased the Brennan parcel on a Friday in late September, 1878. She stood outside the bank with him when he came out with the deed in his hand, squinting in the afternoon sun, and he held it up and looked at it with the expression of a man who has been moving his whole life and has just felt solid ground. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. He looked at her. I want to take you to see it, he said. The land. I want you to see what I am looking at when I think about it. All right, she said. They rode out the following Sunday. Dorothy on the store's old gray gelding that she kept for deliveries, Daniel on his sorrel. The Brennan parcel was 6 miles north of town, and the road there was the kind of road that existed mainly in theory, 2 faint tracks through the grass with a gap in the middle where the vegetation grew undisturbed. The morning was clear, and the sky was the enormous deep blue of a Texas October morning, and the grass had gone to its autumn gold, and the low hills to the north were soft purple in the distance. The land was good land. Dorothy could see it, having grown up listening to her father and the ranchers who came through the store discuss land with the specific vocabulary of people who understood it. The grass was thick, and the soil dark where the creek ran through the eastern portion of the property, and there was a stand of post oak in the northwest corner that would provide shelter from the north winds. She rode around the boundaries with him, listening while he described what he was thinking, where the cattle would graze through winter, where a proper barn would go, where eventually a house might be placed for best exposure, facing southeast for morning sun with the tree line to the north as a windbreak. There, she said, pointing at a slight rise between the creek and the tree line, that is where the house should be. You get the morning light, you have the oaks behind you, and the creek is close enough for water but high enough that you will not flood. He looked at the spot. Yes, he said, that is exactly right. She looked at him looking at the land, and she looked at the land itself, and she felt something shift very quietly and decisively inside her, the way a key turns in a lock. The autumn of 1878 in Harlow Creek was gentle and long, and Dorothy Donnelly began to understand, as it went on, that she was in love with Daniel Hartwell in the serious, bedrock way that is different from the bright, atmospheric feeling she had mistaken for love before. This love did not present itself with drama or declaration. It was simply present, the way the ground is present, solid and reliable, and there when she put her weight on it. She did not say anything about it immediately. She was still learning to trust the thing, the same way you learn to trust a new floor by testing it gradually before putting your full weight down. He came to the store every day now that he was working the Brennan land, often to purchase supplies he needed for the work, lumber, nails, hinges, feed for the 2 additional horses he had bought, but also, she understood clearly, to see her. He did not pretend it was only about the supplies. He made no pretense about anything. One afternoon in November he came in with sawdust in his hair from working on the frame of the barn he was building, and he bought a pound of coffee and stayed to tell her about the progress, and she listened with her elbows on the counter and her chin in her hand, and he caught himself mid-sentence and stopped and looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was going to say something, but I lost the thread." "You were describing the east wall of the barn," she said. "Right," he said. He did not finish the sentence about the barn. "Daniel," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are going to have to say what you are thinking eventually," she said. "I find that I am not inclined to wait indefinitely." He looked at her steadily. "I am thinking that I am in love with you," he said. "I have been aware of this for some time. I have been following your lead on the timing of saying so." She stood up from leaning on the counter. "Good," she said, "because I find that I am in love with you as well." The moment held itself still for a second. He came around the counter, which he had never done before, and she did not move back, and he took her face in both his hands with the careful deliberateness he applied to everything and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was the kind of kiss that is not a beginning so much as an acknowledgement of something that has already been true for a long time. When they stepped back, he was looking at her with an expression she had never quite seen on a human face before, or perhaps she had never been present enough to recognize it, which was the expression of someone who has found the thing they did not know they were looking for. "All right," she said. Her voice was steady and she was glad of it. "All right," he agreed. The town of Harlow Creek responded to this development with the enthusiasm of a community that has been waiting for news. Mrs. Hatch stopped Dorothy on the street the very next day and said she was so glad, in a tone that suggested she had been personally invested in the outcome, and Reverend Mallory shook Daniel's hand at church on Sunday with a warmth that was not entirely professional, and Tom Prentice at the saloon reportedly bought a round for the house in celebration, which was generous by any standard. Dorothy did not mind the town's attention in the way she had once minded it. The difference was the quality of the story it was responding to. Previously, the town's gaze had been full of sympathy, which was kind but which reminded her constantly of what had happened. Now the town's attention felt like participation, like they were all part of something that was going somewhere good. She brought the cedar chest out of the bedroom corner one afternoon in December and set it in the main room by the window. She had been thinking about the dress inside it for weeks, not obsessively but with a new, clear-eyed consideration. The dress was a beautiful piece of work. She had made it with skill and love, and the fact that it had been made for the wrong person did not unmake those qualities. Daniel came over for supper that evening, which had become a regular occurrence, and she cooked the beef stew she did well, and they ate at the kitchen table in the easy companionship that had become as natural as breathing. And after supper, she made coffee and they moved to the main room, and he sat in her father's armchair and she sat in the smaller chair across from him, and the cedar chest was between them. He looked at it and then at her. "That is the cedar chest from your bedroom," he said, because she had mentioned it in passing once. "It is," she said. "I moved it in here today." He waited, which was something she had come to appreciate deeply about him, his willingness to wait for things to be said in the time they needed. "The dress I told you about," she said. "The wedding dress, it is in there." He was quiet for a moment. "I brought it out because I have been thinking about it," she said. "I sewed it myself over 6 weeks. It is a good dress. I put a great deal of work into it, and I am actually rather proud of it." She looked at the chest. "It has been in there 3 years, and I have been treating it like something shameful. But it is not shameful. It is a dress I made with my own hands." "No," he said. "It is not shameful." She looked at him. "Would you like to see it?" He held her gaze for a moment, something moving in his face that was serious and good. "Yes," he said, "if you want to show me." She opened the chest and brought the dress out, still in its tissue paper, and unwrapped it carefully on the settee beside her. In the lamplight of the main room, the white cotton lawn was warm and the Brussels lace was delicate, and the embroidered bluebonnets along the hem were exactly as she had left them, small and precise, and exactly the color of Texas bluebonnets in spring. Daniel looked at it without saying anything for a moment. "Dorothy," he said, "that is extraordinary work." "Thank you," she said. "I used to sew quite seriously. I have not made much since." She ran a finger along the lace at the cuff. "I thought I might take it out and assess it, make sure it is all right. The lavender and cedar preserved it well." "It looks perfect," he said. She looked at it with a different eye than she had 3 years ago. She was not the same person who had sewn it. She was taller in some way she couldn't measure, more solid, more honestly herself. And the dress was what it was, a beautiful, honest piece of her own making that had been folded away in the dark too long. "I wonder if it still fits," she said aloud, almost to herself. "Does it?" Daniel said. She looked up at him. There was something in the way he asked it, direct and present and steady, that was not intrusive but was simply honest, the same way everything about him was honest. "I have not tried it," she said. "I do not know." "Then perhaps you should find out," he said gently. "Not for any reason but your own. To know." She picked up the dress and carried it to the bedroom, and she changed out of her everyday dress in the lamplight of the room and stepped carefully into the wedding dress and did the buttons up the back as far as she could reach, which was most of them, and then stood in front of the small mirror above her washstand and looked at herself. It fit. It fit almost perfectly, perhaps slightly more fitted than when she had first made it because she had been baking a great deal lately, and the proof was in the extra inch at the waist. But otherwise it was as though the dress had been made for the person she was now rather than the person she had been. The cotton lawn fell to the floor in a clean, full sweep, and the Brussels lace caught the lamplight, and the bluebonnets at the hem were exactly as she had embroidered them. She stood looking at herself for a long time. She was not the woman who had stood in this town, waiting for a wagon that never came. She was not the woman who had folded herself into an empty Wednesday morning and told herself she was fine. She was Dorothy Donnelly, who ran her father's store and knew how to negotiate contracts and make good beef stew and love carefully but really and truly, and the dress, which she had made with her own hands, fit her. She went back out to the main room, still wearing the dress. Daniel stood up from the armchair. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was something so full and real that she felt it physically. "It fits," she said. "It does," he said, and his voice was lower and quieter than usual and his eyes were steady on her. "Dorothy, it is beautiful. You are beautiful." She looked down at the bluebonnets along the hem. "I embroidered those myself," she said. "I wanted something of home." "You were very young to be that wise," he said. She looked up. "I was not that young. I was 23. "Young to know that you would always want something of home," he said. She thought about that. "Perhaps," she said. He crossed the room to her and he took her hands, which were slightly cold because the evening had gone cool, and he held them in his, which were warm. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. She knew what he was going to ask. She had known it was coming in the way you know a storm is coming, not from one sign but from everything in the air. "Ask," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "Dorothy Donnelly. I want to marry you, and I want to build the house on that rise between the creek and the oaks, and I want to make a life in this country with you. I am asking you plainly, and I am not in a hurry for the answer, but I wanted you to know that this is what I want." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was burning between them, and outside, the December wind was going through Harlow Creek, making the ordinary sounds of a Texas winter night. "Yes," she said. The word came out clear and certain, and she felt the certainty of it all the way through, none of the hollow, breathless quality that uncertainty disguises as passion, just a real, grounded yes. "Yes, Daniel, I will marry you." He kissed her again, and she kissed him back in the wedding dress she had sewn 3 years ago for a different life, and she thought that the dress, which had been waiting all this time, had simply been waiting for the right story to belong to. They were married in January of 1879 in the church of Harlow Creek, on a Saturday when the air was sharp and cold, and the sky was that particular winter blue that looks like it goes on forever. Dorothy wore the dress she had sewn herself, and the Brussels lace caught the winter light coming through the church windows, and the bluebonnets along the hem were a small declaration of home and intention, and the kind of hope that survives. Daniel stood at the altar in a dark suit he had purchased in Abilene, and he watched her walk down the aisle with the same steady, direct attention he gave to everything, and she met his eyes when she was still halfway down and kept them there, because this time she was not looking away from anything. Reverend Mallory performed the ceremony with visible and understandable satisfaction. The church was full because Harlow Creek was a small town, and there was no such thing as a quiet wedding in it. And the people in the pews included Mrs. Hatch from the millinery shop and Tom Prentice, who had left the saloon, to a very surprised young bartender for the duration, and old Mr. Perkins with his perennially broken harness, and the widow Parker who cried happily from the second pew, and all the hands from the Alcott Ranch who were off on Saturdays, and a few dozen people whom Dorothy and Daniel knew in the interlocking, overlapping way you know everyone in a small town. When they were pronounced married and Daniel kissed her, the church made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a collective exhale, as though it had been holding a breath for 3 years on Dorothy's behalf and could now finally release it. After the ceremony, they had a supper at the church hall organized primarily by Mrs. Parker and Mrs. Hatch, who had collaborated with a thoroughness that impressed even people who knew them well. There was roast beef and venison, and more pies than any reasonable number of people should have been able to eat, and someone had brought out a fiddle and a guitar, and later in the evening there was dancing on the swept floor of the hall, and Dorothy danced with her husband, which was a word she turned over in her mind like a small bright stone, husband, his hand solid on her waist and her hand in his, turning in the lamplight while the fiddle played. "You are grinning," Daniel said, looking down at her. "I am," she agreed and made no effort to stop. "Good," he said. He pressed her a little closer, and she let him, and they danced on into the January evening, while Harlow Creek celebrated around them with the generous enthusiasm of a town that had been invested in this outcome. They spent the first weeks of their marriage in Dorothy's house, while Daniel worked steadily on the house on the Brennan land. He had a gift for construction that she had not known about until she saw it, a precise, patient understanding of how things fit together that made the house go up steadily through the cold months. He hired 2 men from town to help with the heavy work, and the frame went up in February, and by March the roof was on, and by April, when the bluebonnets were actually blooming in the fields around Harlow Creek, the house was livable. It was not a large house, 3 rooms to begin with, but it was solid and well-made and placed exactly where Dorothy had said, on the rise between the creek and the oaks, with the morning light coming in the southeast windows and the post oak grove dark and wind-breaking behind it. Daniel had built a deep porch along the front that faced south, and the first evening they spent there together, sitting on the porch in the last of the April light with the bluebonnets visible in the grass below the rise and the creek shining through the trees, Dorothy thought that she had never in her life felt as precisely and completely in the right place as she did in that moment. "What are you thinking?" Daniel said. He was beside her on the porch step, his shoulder against hers. "That this is the right place for the house," she said. "That I was right when I pointed to it." "You were," he said. He reached over and took her hand. "I was also thinking," she said, "that I am going to sell the store." He turned to look at her. This was not something they had discussed. "I have been considering it for a while," she said. "The store was my father's and then it was mine, and I am grateful for it. But I do not want to spend the rest of my life in that building." She looked out at the land. "Young Henry Garrett has been working for me 3 mornings a week and he wants to buy it. He is 20 years old and serious and his family is solid. I think my father would approve of him." "It is your store," Daniel said. "Whatever you decide." "It is," she said, "and I have decided." She looked at him. "There is a great deal of work to be done here. The land, the cattle, the house, the garden. I would rather put my effort into this." "Dorothy," he said, and in his voice was something warm and whole that needed no further words. She sold the store to Henry Garrett in May of 1879, for a fair price that she negotiated herself naturally, and she closed the transaction on a Friday afternoon and walked out of the building where she had spent most of her life and stood on the porch where she had first seen Daniel ride into town just over a year ago, and she felt the particular, complicated feeling of an ending that is also a beginning. She did not look back as she walked home. There was no need. She knew what was behind her and she knew what was ahead, and both were real and good, and there was nothing left unfinished. The spring of 1879 on the Hartwell land was a season of work so constant and absorbing that Dorothy understood, for the first time, what it meant to be truly used up by a day in a way that did not leave any room for the old anxieties and the old, hollow silences. She learned cattle work by doing it, which was the only way to learn in the territory. She could not do everything that Daniel did. The heavier physical labor was his, but she could do a great deal, and she did it without asking for credit or accommodation, and Daniel worked beside her without condescension or excessive concern, which was exactly what she wanted. They built a kitchen garden in the curve of the rise below the house, and Dorothy planted it with the thoroughness and slightly competitive intensity she brought to everything: tomatoes and beans and squash and corn, and a section of herbs along the south wall that she kept with particular care. The garden produced abundantly by summer, and she canned and preserved with a focus that would have impressed even the widow Parker. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the light change over the Hartwell land, and Daniel whittled and Dorothy sewed, not a wedding dress this time but practical things: curtains for the windows, shirts for Daniel whose existing ones were being slowly destroyed by serious work, a quilt that she was piecing from fabric remnants she had kept from the store. They talked in the evenings about everything, about the cattle and the land and the people of the town, and the state of the territory and the wider world that came to them in 3-day-old newspapers from San Antonio. They talked about the politics of Texas and the complicated, ongoing injustice of what was happening across the territory to the Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had lived on this land for generations before any of them had arrived, displaced now by fences and cattle drives, and the relentless push of settlement that moved across the plains without much care for what it displaced. Daniel talked about this with a seriousness and a moral directness that Dorothy respected because it would have been easy in their time and place not to think about it at all. "My grandfather came from Ohio with nothing," Daniel said one evening. "He settled on land that was not anyone else's to give him, technically. I think about that. Most of the land in this country has that history," Dorothy said. "That does not make it right. It means the debt is very large." "Yes," he said, "it does." They could not resolve what could not be resolved by 2 people on a porch, but they held the knowledge of it honestly, which was more than many people in the territory were willing to do, and Dorothy thought that holding the knowledge honestly was at least better than not holding it at all. By autumn of 1879, the The Hartwell cattle operation had 12 head beyond the foundation stock Daniel had started with, and a new calf pen was under construction, and Dorothy had taught herself to keep books for the operation with the same methodical precision she had brought to her father's store. She kept a careful record of every purchase and sale and expenditure, and she could tell Daniel at any point in the month exactly where the operation stood financially, which he found deeply useful and said so without embarrassment, because he was good with cattle and good with land, and less naturally inclined toward numbers, and he had no pretense about his limitations. In December of 1879, Dorothy told Daniel she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, simply and directly, because she did not know another way to say important things. He put down his coffee cup and stood up and came to her and held her for a long moment with her face against his shoulder, and she felt his breath go slow and deep against her hair. "A family," he said, as though he was trying the word out. "Yes," she said, "in the summer sometime. July, I think." He stepped back and looked at her with that open, full expression that she had catalogued in her memory as one of the definitive expressions of her life. "Dorothy," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you well?" "How are you feeling?" "Slightly unwell in the mornings," she said honestly. "Otherwise quite well. I am not alarmed." "We should speak to Dr. Whitfield," he said. "We will," she said. "But first you should finish your coffee because you have fencing to check." He laughed, which was a sound she thought she could listen to for the rest of her life without it losing anything. He drank his coffee and went out to check the fencing, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand flat against the front of her dress and breathed slowly and thought about July. The winter was cold and clear, and they were busy with the cattle and the house, and preparing for what was coming, and there was not one day of it that was less than full or less than good. Daniel added a room to the house in February, working on the cold days between storms with a deliberateness that meant it was done properly, and the room was small and warm and exactly right. Their son was born in July of 1880, on a hot Tuesday morning when the bluebonnets were long gone, and the summer grass was full and gold. Dorothy labored through the morning with Dr. Whitfield in attendance and Daniel in the next room doing something with his hands every time she heard him move, probably whittling, she thought, in the intervals between a worry he was managing with his characteristic quiet discipline. The baby was healthy and loud about it, which Dr. Whitfield said was the best possible sign, and when Daniel came into the room and stood over the bed looking down at the both of them, his son red-faced and furious in the crook of Dorothy's arm, Dorothy looked at her husband's face and thought that she had never in her life seen a person so entirely present in a moment. "Franklin," she said, "for my father." He looked at her. "Franklin Daniel Hartwell," he said. "Yes." The baby, apparently satisfied with his name, fell asleep. Harlow Creek celebrated the arrival of Franklin Hartwell with the enthusiasm it brought to all occasions, and Mrs. Hatch made a small quilt, and Mrs. Parker brought 3 kinds of pie, and Tom Prentice sent over a bottle of whiskey that Dorothy allowed Daniel to open in moderation, and that he shared with Mr. Perkins, who came by to pay his respects. Henry Garrett came out from the store, which was thriving under his management, and Dorothy was genuinely glad to see it. The year Franklin was born was a good year for cattle and a fair year for rain, and by the end of it the Hartwell operation had 22 head and the books were solid. Dorothy managed the financial end with an efficiency that Daniel described to anyone who asked as the thing that made the whole enterprise possible, and he said it without any of the awkwardness some men brought to acknowledging a woman's competence, just as a straightforward fact about how their life worked. Franklin grew through the second half of 1880 and into 1881 with the determined, loud enthusiasm of a child who has decided to be interested in everything. He was dark-haired like Daniel and green-eyed like Dorothy, and he had the combination of his father's steadiness and his mother's precision that showed up very early as a talent for stacking things, blocks, cans, rocks from the creek, into structures of surprising structural integrity for someone under 2 years old. Dorothy watched her son discover the world from the porch of the house she had helped build. In the morning light she had predicted when she pointed to the rise between the creek and the oaks, and she thought about the woman who had opened a cedar chest alone in a bedroom 3 years ago, and thought that if she could have told that woman what was coming, the woman would probably not have believed her, because some kinds of happiness are too specific and solid to imagine from a distance. She took the wedding dress out of the cedar chest again the following spring. She took it out carefully and hung it in the bedroom and looked at it for a while. It had served its purpose, which was not the purpose she had originally intended for it. It had told Daniel something about who she was, and had told her something about who she had become, and it had witnessed the moment she had said yes to a man who meant exactly what he said. She thought about what to do with it. She ended up cutting the lace trim off carefully and preserving it folded in tissue paper in the cedar chest, because it was beautiful and had cost her real money and had real value. The dress itself she took apart at the seams with a seam ripper, methodically and without sentimentality, and from the white cotton lawn she made 3 things. She made a baptismal gown for Franklin that he had already used. She made curtains for the new room, and from the remnant she made a small, square piece embroidered with bluebonnets that she framed and hung above the kitchen door, because the bluebonnets had been right from the beginning. They were Texas flowers, and she had always wanted something of home, and this was home. The cedar chest stayed at the foot of the bed. Now she kept blankets in it. By the spring of 1882, Franklin was almost 2 and learning to walk with the determined, slightly staggering independence of a child who has decided he does not need assistance. The cattle operation had grown to 38 head, and Daniel was talking about hiring a hand for the summer. Dorothy was expecting again and had told Daniel on a March morning with the same directness she had used the first time. "Another summer," Daniel said, doing the calculation. "September this time," she said, "or thereabouts." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you feeling well?" "Better than the first time in the mornings," she said. "Less unwell. I take it as a good sign." "Good," he said. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the unconscious, natural gesture of a man deeply accustomed to the person in front of him. "Dorothy." "Yes," she said. "I just wanted to say your name," he said. "Nothing particular." She smiled at him. 4 years of marriage, and she still smiled at him the way she had smiled that first January in the church hall with the fiddle playing, and she was glad of it, that it had not diminished or become routine in the way she had sometimes feared happiness did. Their daughter arrived in September of 1882, quieter than Franklin had been at birth, but alert and watchful from the first moment, looking around the room with a focused attention that Dorothy recognized as her own. "Clara," Dorothy said before Daniel could speak. She looked at her daughter's small, serious face. "Clara Jean Hartwell." "After your mother," Daniel said. Dorothy had told him once that her mother, who had died when Dorothy was 8, had been named Jean. "After my mother," she confirmed. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who has decided that the world is larger and more worth having than he had previously accounted for. The life they built on the Hartwell land in the years that followed was a life that was ordinary and extraordinary in the way all genuine lives are, full of work and seasons, and the particular texture of a specific place and a specific people. Franklin grew into a serious, solid boy who followed his father around the cattle operation with an apprentice's focused attention from about age 4, and Clara grew into a child of remarkable vocabulary who had opinions about everything, and stated them with a clarity that Dorothy recognized as characteristic and found quietly satisfying. Daniel expanded the cattle operation steadily and carefully, never faster than the land and the finances could support. By 1885, they had 60 head and had hired 2 hands on a permanent basis, young men from the territory who boarded in a small bunkhouse Daniel had built at the east edge of the property. Dorothy managed the books and the household and the kitchen garden, and had added a section of medicinal herbs to the garden that she had learned from a book Dr. Whitfield had lent her. and from which she made tinctures and preparations that she shared with neighbors and eventually with people from Harlow Creek who came out specifically for them. She was, she thought, someone her father would have recognized and approved of. She was practical and generous, and she knew things, and she kept her accounts straight, and she was honest with people even when honesty was uncomfortable. She was also, she thought, someone that the woman who had opened the cedar chest alone would not have fully recognized, because that woman had been smaller in some way, not in worth but in territory, confined by the shape of what had been done to her. This Dorothy was larger, more fully occupying her own life, and she thought that this was the thing that the years with Daniel had done, not given her confidence she had not had, but simply created conditions in which the confidence she had always had could actually operate. The spring of 1886 brought a difficult stretch. 2 of the Hartwell cattle contracted a respiratory illness, and despite Dr. Whitfield's consultation and Dorothy's careful attention to the medicinal preparations she had learned, they lost 1 animal and spent 3 weeks in an anxious middle ground with the second. During this time, Dorothy was up before dawn every morning and often out to the pen in the cold dark of early morning to check on the sick animal, and Daniel was working himself to a thread between the cattle and the rest of the operation, and trying not to let the fear show too much. They sat on the porch one evening in the middle of this period, both of them tired, the quiet around them full of the early spring sounds of frogs at the creek and the distant cattle sounds from the field. "We will lose some seasons," Dorothy said. "We knew that going in." "I know," he said. He was rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture she knew meant he was carrying something he was not saying. "Daniel," she said. He looked at her. There was tiredness in his face and something else, the specific worry of a man who takes responsibility for things and finds the limits of what responsibility can control. "We can afford the loss," she said. "The books are solid. We lose this animal and we are set back, but we are not broken." She reached over and put her hand on his knee. "We are not broken." He put his hand over hers. "I know," he said. "I know we are not. It is just when I think about what it would mean to lose this whole thing we have built." "I know," she said. "I think about that too." She looked out at the dark land. "But we have already lost things, both of us, and we are still here. We are still exactly here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have never been more grateful for anything in my life than I am for you." She looked at him. In the lamplight from the window, his face was tired and honest and completely familiar, the face she had come to know as well as her own, better in some ways. "I know," she said. "I feel the same way." He raised her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips, an old habit of his that she had never lost the capacity to be moved by. They saved the second animal. It recovered slowly through April, and by May was in the field with the rest, and the worry eased back into the general productive anxiety of running a cattle operation in the Texas territory, which was a manageable and familiar kind. The years of the late 1880s were the years of fullness, the word that came to Dorothy when she thought about them later. The children grew, and the land grew with them, and the house was added to again. A second story that Daniel and 2 carpenters from Harlow Creek built in the summer of 1887, so that Franklin and Clara each had a room of their own, and stopped their ongoing territorial negotiations over the single room they had shared. Franklin at 7 was his father's shadow in the cattle operation, and had already decided, with the serene certainty of a child who has made an irrevocable decision, that this was what he was going to do with his life. Clara at 5 had decided nothing yet, but was interested in everything, and was learning to read with a focus that reminded Dorothy of herself at that age, sitting in her father's store absorbing the words from every label and package on the shelves. Dorothy taught Clara to read from the books on the shelf above the fireplace, and from the 3-day-old San Antonio newspapers, sitting at the kitchen table in the mornings after breakfast with the sun coming in the southeast windows, the way she had planned for it to come. She taught her with patience and joy, and Clara learned quickly and badly wanted to be ahead of where she was, which Dorothy also recognized as characteristic and did not discourage but channeled. She was teaching Clara to sew by 1889. Not a wedding dress, nothing so ambitious at first but small things, a handkerchief, a patch on a pair of Franklin's work trousers, the basic running stitch that was the foundation of everything else. Clara's hands were quick, and her attention was good, and she had opinions about color and fabric choice that Dorothy found entirely reasonable. "When you are older," Dorothy told her, sitting beside her one afternoon, "you will be able to make almost anything you need." "Including a dress," Clara said. "Including a dress," Dorothy confirmed. Clara thought about this. "Did you make your wedding dress?" she asked with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of a 7-year-old. Dorothy looked at her needle. "I did," she said. "A long time ago." "Can I see it?" Clara asked. "The dress is not whole anymore," Dorothy said. "I made it into other things. The fabric is the curtain in your room, and the baptismal gown you wore as a baby, and the picture above the kitchen door." Clara turned and looked at the framed bluebonnets above the kitchen door. She looked at it for a moment. "You made all that from your wedding dress." "I did," Dorothy said. "When something cannot serve its original purpose, you find what else it can be. Good fabric does not go to waste." Clara considered this with the seriousness of a child who is actually thinking about what has been said. "That is practical," she said. "Yes," Dorothy said. "Your father likes to say it is a philosophy." "What is a philosophy?" Clara asked. "A way of looking at things," Dorothy said. Daniel came in from the fields at that point, smelling of sun and cattle and honest work, and he saw them at the table with their sewing and smiled the way he always smiled at this particular sight, quietly and completely. "What are we making?" he said, washing his hands at the basin. "Clara is making a handkerchief," Dorothy said. "It has 4 stitches in it so far," Clara said, holding it up. "That is 4 more than it had this morning," Daniel said. "That is what Mama said," Clara told him. "Your mother is a woman of consistent and correct opinions," Daniel said. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the table to look at the handkerchief with appropriate seriousness, and Dorothy watched him with Clara and felt the particular fullness of a moment that does not announce itself as important but is. The winter of 1889 brought a letter from Daniel's brother in Kansas, the first letter in 2 years. The brother's name was Robert, and it emerged from the letter, in poor circumstances following a failed farming venture, his wife ill and money very short. Daniel sat with the letter for an evening and then came to Dorothy. "I want to send him money," he said. "A significant amount." "How significant?" Dorothy asked. He named the amount. "It was substantial enough to make a real difference to the books for the quarter." "Of course," Dorothy said without hesitation. He looked at her. "He is your brother," she said, "and people should be helped when they can be helped. The books will recover." She reached for the pen and paper on the table. "Let us write the letter together." The letter went with the money, and Robert Hartwell wrote back 2 months later from a better situation, his wife recovering, a new position secured, and the tone of the letter was full of a gratitude that was genuine and humbling. Daniel read it twice and folded it carefully and put it in the tin box where he kept important papers. "He wants to come and see the operation someday," he said. "He should," Dorothy said. "There is room enough." The new century came eventually, as centuries do, without drama or visible change. It was January of 1900, and Dorothy was 47 years old, and Daniel was 52, and Franklin was 19 and working the cattle operation with his father on a full, serious basis that was fast approaching partnership. Clara was 17 and had opinions about everything, including, increasingly, a young man from Harlow Creek named Peter Ames who worked at the telegraph office and had the specific, focused kind of attention that Dorothy recognized from experience as a sign of genuine interest. She watched her daughter navigate this with the same careful attention she had once navigated it herself, the balance between caution and openness, between the learned protection of the heart and the willingness to try. "He seems honest," Dorothy told Daniel one evening about Peter Ames. "He seems very taken with her," Daniel said. "That may or may not be the same thing," Dorothy said. "You were both," Daniel said. "When I met you, you were honest and I was very taken with you." She looked at him across the kitchen table. He was 52 and the lines around his eyes had deepened and his dark hair had gone largely gray, and she thought he looked more like himself than he ever had, as though age had simply clarified something that had always been there. "You were patient," she said. "That was what mattered." "You were worth being patient for," he said simply. She reached across the table and put her hand on his, a gesture that had become in 21 years of marriage as natural and necessary as breathing, and he turned his hand over and held hers the way he always had. And outside, the Hartwell land was going about its winter business under a January sky. And inside the house, there was the smell of coffee and lamp oil and the sound of Clara, somewhere upstairs with her book, and Franklin's voice outside talking to one of the hands, and the cedar chest at the foot of their bed upstairs full of blankets against the cold. They had 32 years ahead of them, though they did not know this. They knew only what they had, which was the land and the season and each other and their children, and the particular texture of a life that had been built on honest foundations, plank by plank, over a great many good and difficult years. Dorothy Donnelly Hartwell, who had sewn her own wedding dress in the long, careful evenings of a life she had not yet begun to imagine, and who had folded it away in lavender and cedar and walked past it for 3 years without letting herself see it, and who had finally brought it into the lamplight of her own house and let it be seen, and had then taken it apart with careful, purposeful hands and made it into curtains and a baptismal gown and a picture of bluebonnets that hung above the kitchen door. Thought sometimes about the uses of fabric and the uses of time, about how the same material can be made into different things depending on who is holding the needle. She thought about the morning Daniel had ridden into town on his sorrel mare, the white star on the horse's forehead, the ease with which he had swung down from the saddle, the way he had touched the brim of his hat to her, and then looked at the store sign with that brief, honest smile. She thought about the horehound candies and the thread she had helped him match and the walks under the cottonwoods and the evenings on the porch and the Sunday when she had ridden out to see the land that would become their land, and she had pointed to the rise between the creek and the oaks and said, "There, that is where the house should be." The house was there. It was solid and warm, and it faced southeast for the morning light with the post oak grove behind it. And in the spring, the bluebonnets came up in the grass below the rise the way they always had, because bluebonnets were Texas flowers and they did not need anyone's permission. She was home. She had always been in some sense home, in this territory, in this land, in this specific place in the world. But now she was home in the full sense of the word, not just located somewhere but belonging somewhere, which was a different and deeper thing. Daniel came in from checking the stock on a January evening in 1900, shaking the cold off his coat and hanging it on the peg by the door, and she was at the stove with coffee ready, and she handed him a cup and he took it with both hands and held it a moment for the warmth before drinking, and he looked at her over the rim. "Good day?" she asked. "Good day," he confirmed. "The new stock are settling in well. Franklin thinks we should expand the north pasture in the spring. What do you think?" She asked. "I think Franklin is probably right," he said. "He usually is about the cattle," she smiled. "He is his father's son." "He is his mother's son too," Daniel said. "He keeps better books than I ever did." They sat at the table with their coffee, while the January wind moved around the house, and found no purchase against the solid walls Daniel had built. And they talked about the north pasture, and about Clara and Peter Ames, who was apparently going to speak to Daniel soon about a matter they all understood, and about Robert's most recent letter from Kansas, which had described his grandchildren with a pride that was charming, and about 100 small, ordinary things that were the substance of their life together. Later they went upstairs, past the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and Dorothy ran her hand briefly along the top of it as she always did now, not with grief or weight but with something that was more like acknowledgement, the way you nod to someone you know well in passing, recognizing without lingering. The chest was full of blankets now. It had been full of blankets for 20 years. She got into bed and Daniel sat on the edge of it for a moment, as he always did, and looked at her with the easy, thorough attention of a man who has looked at the same person for 21 years and has not lost his interest in what he sees. "Dorothy," he said. "Yes," she said. "Nothing particular," he said, the same words he had used once before. "I just wanted to say your name." She reached up and touched his face, the lines at the corner of his eyes that came from squinting into bright distances, the jaw that was set and honest and entirely familiar. "Daniel," she said. He turned and lay beside her, and the lamp was blown out, and outside the Hartwell land was dark and quiet in theirs, and the bluebonnets were sleeping in the frozen ground waiting for spring. And above the kitchen door downstairs, the framed embroidery held its small, precise pattern of Texas flowers in the dark. The same flowers she had once sewn along the hem of a dress she had made for a life that had not come, and that had ended up trimming instead the life she had actually been given, which was richer and realer, and more hers than anything she had been able to imagine when she was young and hopeful, and sitting up late by lamplight with a needle and a thread, and a heart full of something that was not yet ready to become what it was going to become. But that was all right. That was more than all right. Some things need time, and some dresses need to wait, and some stories need to go by an unexpected road to reach the place they were always going. This was hers.